Welcome everyone to this month's View from the Mount. We're broadcasting live from Meditation Mount, overlooking the Ojai Valley here in Southern California. Today's theme is being of service in turbulent times, and we'll take time to examine some potential underlying causes of the current precarious state of the world, and we'll also explore how best we can assist in restoring health and hope to our world. Basically, how can we be of service? So let's begin by creating a receptive group field through which we can be impressed and through which we can gain new insights together as we inquire the way together. So let's begin by taking several slow, deep, gentle breaths to bring ourselves present in the here and now. And as we take these gentle breaths, we focus first on the physical body and release any tension that we may be holding, and allow it to be relaxed. And we do the same with the emotional body, breathing out any tension and allowing it to become calm and stable. And likewise with the mind, letting go of any extraneous thoughts that may be swirling. We breathe these out and we breathe in a sense of serenity. Now let's stand together inside the deep silence of the heart. And inside our heart, we both see and sense the fire of love burning at the core of our being. This is the eternal flame that we all share. And now from that fire of love, send lines of fiery love to all on this broadcast, imagining us weaving together a matrix of lighted love to create a group chalice. And in this group chalice, we will receive new insights, new wisdom, new light that helps us to be of greater service. So let us hold this vision, let us stand together in this group field. Thank you. So perhaps we can begin our journey with a few words on what we mean by service at Meditation Mount. It's clearly stated in the wisdom teachings associated with our lineage that the natural urge of the soul is to give freely of its love in service. Very simple. The soul gives freely of its love in service. It's like a brightly shining sun radiating its light and warmth to all, but it asks for nothing in return. So our soul, like the sun, is essentially primed for giving. Our soul naturally seeks to serve. And by responding wholeheartedly to the compelling call to be of service, we can harness and mobilize the power of our soul to meet the evolutionary needs of humanity at this stage in our growth, to overcome the really tough challenges that we're facing at these times, and to help to bring consonance and order on a new and higher turn of the spiral, because we are moving out of chaos, which is this present time of churning, into a new order, a new harmony. So for me, service can be viewed as any intentional act that supports the betterment of life on earth for all beings. And service is predicated on the realization that each of us is an integral an essential aspect of the one life. Therefore, all that we think and say and do affects the whole. It serves the good of the whole when we have that intention. And then as the whole is nourished by our giving, the whole naturally and reciprocally nourishes all of its constituent parts. And I believe a lived experience of answering the call of the soul is an essential requirement in fully understanding the spiritual adage, it is in giving that we received. So service is about giving, and we receive through our giving. Therefore, we're not here to find out what we can take from life. We are part of that new awareness that realizes that life is a radiant state of being. It's an act of continuous giving. However, the painful reality is that every time we are not in alignment with that, any time we think and act in egotistical and separative ways, we do a great disservice to the entire community of lives upon this terrestrial sphere. So the question I ask myself, am I acting as an agent of service or an agent of disservice by how I show up each day, how I comport myself, how I behave? We know that energy follows thought. That's a spiritual maxim we've mentioned many times. But if energy follows thought, then what we see on the outside in the world must be a precipitation and manifestation of an inner state. And this is true for us as individuals, as well as collectively for nation states and the whole human family. So with this in mind, I invite us to examine the current state of the world and trace some possible causes behind all that we are now witnessing. Now, this is not going to be a definitive understanding, but just to begin to fathom what's taking place on the planet so that we can act from clarity, act from a deeper place of knowing. I would say that it appears that the health of our societal system has been compromised. Now, this compromising of our health may have happened through ignorance. It may have happened also through intentional and nefarious activities on the part of some. And I'll offer some thoughts for us to ponder. The health of any living system or organism depends on the free flow and circulation of the life force or chi force around the whole system. And in this way, all the parts are nourished and working together for the overall well-being of that system. So really it means a healthy system has no blockages. But this measurement of health is not what is seen when we view the world through a humanitarian, political, or spiritual lens at the moment. I believe we're in a health crisis at a systems level. We're experiencing a systems breakdown in many fields of human endeavor, where the natural coherence and interconnectivity of the various parts inside the whole field has been fractured. We are in a disconnected and incoherent system. So whenever the part, be that an individual, you and I, be that a political party, a religious movement, or even a nation, whenever that part seeks to make itself greater than others, or to actually become the whole itself, then we are seeing the telltale signs and symptoms of a re-emerging culture of colonization. And as we look around and view the apparent rise and spread of self-centeredness, where the part consistently and insistently is attempting to colonize the entire system, my sense is society is in real danger of contracting a colonizing cancer. So what do we mean by cancer? Well, the medical definition is cancer is a term we use for diseases in which abnormal cells divide without control and invade nearby tissues. So the uncontrollable and invasive growth of one cell that multiplies and seeks to take over the whole body to become the predominant life of that ecosystem will eventually cause a life-threatening disease inside the whole body. And in this case, we're talking about the whole body of society. So for me, without blame or judgment, I see this spreading blight of selfishness and self-centeredness that we are witnessing as a malignant malaise that will affect everyone. It will affect all nations, all people. So the question is, why has this global crisis come to a head just now in such an intense matter? There are several underlying causes that we can draw from the ageless wisdom teachings that would be useful to explore. We're not going to go into them in depth, but I just want to touch on them because they provide the background, the context, and some of the reasons why we are in intense times at the moment. I believe we're facing a major crisis because this is a time of great testing and an opportunity for humanity to learn the vital lessons that will allow us to mature, to grow spiritually, and then to cross the threshold into a new era. We can't cross the threshold until we have learned the lessons, until we have made a shift in consciousness. Now, the ageless wisdom teaching actually names the particular test we're facing. It calls it the first initiation. And it explains that this is the first time in human history that we're facing such a momentous test collectively. Because we're wired, we know what's happening 24/7 all around the world. We have social media, we have a sensing of each other now in a way that wasn't possible before. So the first initiation is all about overcoming the forces of materialism. So at the moment, the forces of materialism are the governing forces. They are the attractive forces. And therefore, we are seeking to respond to the call of the soul. And the compelling call of the soul is that which is attracting us. So there's this tug of war between the attractive nature of the dense material world and the attractive nature that is the soul, because the soul is magnetic. So one way we could describe the first initiation is using a biblical phrase. It captures the key lesson of the test. I think you've heard of this phrase before. Man cannot live by bread alone. That means that we need spiritual sustenance. So we need to liberate ourselves from the dependency and identification with material food. We still need material food, but it isn't the be-all and end-all. And the key to passing this first initiation and breaking free of the imprisoning grip of materialism is captured in the following phrase: when the presence of a greater love is born inside the cave of the human heart. This is a really important phrase because it is the key to how we overcome the gravitational pull of materialism. When the heart opens and we sense the presence of a greater love, a sense of empathy and connection, heart connection with others immediately arises, and we begin to move from selfishness to thinking of others, of thinking of something greater than ourselves. So when the heart opens, and when we sense this empathetic connection with our fellow citizens, and when we realize that love is the lifeblood and true currency of all relationship, then we are no longer moved to harm others or anything. So in simple terms, you could say the opening of the heart is key. The opening of the heart so that loving kindness and compassion can fill our lives is really the major turning point. It allows the power of love to become the governing force in our lives and not the calculating mind that may be overly influenced by the unredeemed patterns of our lower nature. So what I'd like to do now is I'll draw upon some of the teachings and those from the Alice Bailey materials and from Agni Yoga. And I want to start with a story that's told in the Agni Yoga teaching. And this story is called The Origin of Mountains. And I will be reading it with you. This is from Fiery World 2, Sloka 5. Let us remember the myth about the origin of mountains. When the planetary creator toiled over the formation of the earth, he gave attention to fertile plains which could provide people with a quiet agriculture. But the mother of the world said, "Verily, people will find bread and trade in the plains, but when gold will pollute the plains, whither shall go the pure in spirit to gather strength? Either let them have wings, or let them have mountains in order to escape from gold." And the Creator answered, "It is too early to give wings to people. They would carry death and destruction. But let us give them mountains, even if some be afraid of them. For others they will be salvation." Thus there are two kinds of people: people of the plains and people of the mountains. One may remember now these myths which foretold the contamination of the planet. So by contamination of the planet by gold, it's basically saying that when we start to look at material things as the reason for living, the acquisition of material things as why we're alive, and therefore we take to the mountains, we take refuge in the mountains. Now these can be physical mountains, or they could be the inner heights of our own consciousness, which we do through meditation. So it points to a time when we'll have to make a shift. Literally, this myth was talking, moving from living in the plains to living in the mountains. So what does that mean? And that's what I'd like to explore with you, what that means. We said that facing the first initiation means that all the unresolved patterns of humanity have to be addressed. Not just addressed from the past few hundred years, but I'm talking about including those unredeemed patterns that even date back to our Atlantean civilization. Now, I want to quote from the Tibetan teacher, the Master DK, because in the Alice Bailey books, it's written an explanation. And basically, if I was to synthesize it, it says that why we're facing these tough times at the moment is we are actually replaying the lessons of Atlantis, when a small group of people held power over the many, and through the misuse of psychic energy, the manipulation of the elemental forces of nature, and a really self-centered attitude, they created volatile conditions that ended up causing the destruction of that continent. And the teachings tell us that we are in front of the same lessons now that we faced and failed back in Atlantis. And, by the way, with the same cast of characters assembled. So they may not be dressed as the priests and the sorcerers of old. It may be the politicians and the technocrats of today. This is not saying they're good or bad. It's just saying, if you haven't learnt a lesson, you'll be represented with it at some time. So humanity is being presented with the lessons of how do we wield power with wisdom. And we failed that test in Atlantis, and now we are facing it again. So it's about how do we break the hold of the few controlling the many? How do we liberate? And how do we free the human spirit so that we have a true plurality here? E pluribus unum, out of the many one. So you've got the shadow of the failed lessons in Atlantis as a backdrop. But all of this is taking place between two ages, whether you call it the Piscean age, the Aquarian age, or whether you talk about moving from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga. And I'd like to use a quote that I used recently in one of the View from the Mounts. It's a quote from Agni Yoga about Kali Yuga and Satya Yuga. It's really useful because it actually tells us the conditions that we're experiencing at the moment. Falsehood and darkness fill the end of Kali Yuga. One must realize this in order not to lose one's strength. It is impossible to avoid the dark days, and only a knowledge of their cause will give one the patience to survive them. Hence, in this Kali Yuga cycle of death and destruction for the age of the mind, there is already emerging a new paradigm of the Satya Yuga cycle, or golden age, a renaissance for the human spirit that will set the tone for the age of Aquarius. It's basically saying these are the characteristics of Kali Yuga. It's when the darkness comes up. It's the darkest of the four yugas, and it's the final one. And then we move into Satya Yuga, which is the beginning of a golden age. So we're in between these two ages where there's a lot of churning. And that's what we're experiencing at the moment, in great churning. So how do we best prepare to face these challenges? What's the most powerful stance we can take in order to be of service in these turbulent times? When I look around the different writings, the different traditions, I go back to the Buddhist tradition because it offers a perspective, an approach that we can take to heart. 100 years ago, the 13th Dalai Lama held a discourse on the Bodhisattva warrior, and it offers much wisdom. And I'd like to share it with you and then just see what it means. What does it mean to be a Bodhisattva warrior or a compassionate warrior today? But let's first explore what the 13th Dalai Lama had to say about this. The Bodhisattva is like the mightiest of warriors, but her enemies are not common foes of flesh and bone. His fight is with the inner delusions, the afflictions of self-cherishing and ego-grasping, those most terrible of demons that catch living beings in the snares of confusion and cause them forever to wander in pain, frustration, and sorrow. Her mission is to harm ignorance and delusion, never living beings. These she looks upon with kindness, patience, and empathy, cherishing them like a mother cherishes her only child. She is the real hero, calmly facing any hardship in order to bring peace, happiness, and liberation to the world. So that's the description that the 13th Dalai Lama gave to the Bodhisattva, the power of the Bodhisattva warrior. So when I reflect on what he said, for me, a compassionate warrior is somebody who challenges all fears, all lies, all false beliefs, all judgments that create suffering and unhappiness. It's a struggle that takes place inside our own heart and mind first. So the compassionate warrior faces each and every challenge with the clarity and awareness that this battle is fought within ourselves, within himself, herself, and that in the end, it is truth and unconditional love who will be the victors. Now, the quest is the same, whether it be a spiritual seeker or a compassionate warrior. It's the same quest, the liberation of the fire of love burning at the heart of all creation. And that, if you remember, is the key to overcoming and passing the first initiation, is when that fire of love, that presence of a greater love is ignited in the heart of humanity. So the ultimate goal of the compassionate warrior is to boldly invoke and to skillfully create the right conditions for this presence of a greater love to enter and to take up permanent residence within the collective heart of humanity. So what are the spiritual requirements for standing right now in 2025 as the compassionate warrior during these times of upheaval and transition, when something more just and joyful is seeking birth within the heart of our common humanity? What I'd like to do is to go through some requirements of the spiritual warrior with you, the compassionate warrior. But just a few more things about my understanding of this compassionate warrior. The compassionate warrior wields the sword of truth with unconditional love and discernment. And the task is to clear the field and to hold and safeguard this sacred, fecund space in which the seeds of a new era may be sown and grown. So this is fiery love and compassion in action. And what I've done is I've taken some requirements that are listed in the different spiritual teachings, and I've just made a very short list that I'd like us to reflect on together, and then briefly to go through and say, well, what are these requirements and how do we meet them? So there are 9 requirements here. There are probably many more, but I've just chosen 9. 9's a good number. Recollection and mindfulness, disidentification, non-investment, continual repurification, non-reaction, non-irritation, dynamism, selfless loving service of the common good, and daring and joyful striving. So what I would love to do with you now is just to go through these one at a time and just briefly explore what they might mean. So recollection and mindfulness was the first one. For me, this means the continuous process of microsecond by microsecond, recalling who I am, why I am, the essential divinity, the true nature that lives inside me as the incarnated self. So recollection and mindfulness is being aware of this essential divinity, carrying this awareness mindfully through everything I do, through all my assignments, so that the warrior lives in the present. The warrior can only really be effective by living in the eternal here and now. It's not living in the past, it's not living in the future, it's living here and now. It's a point of action. It's a point of divine intervention in the here and now. And it's deeply rooted in the light of spirit. And having this awareness, this mindfulness, allows us to discern between the facts and the truth, and between the story and the falsehoods in our own minds, as well as in the mind of humanity. Because as we know, the realm of the mind can be filled with many false perceptions and false beliefs. The mind can be very clever in masking and justifying stories and lies. And we are developing an awareness, a sensitivity that's centered in the heart that knows the truth, because it registers the truth as a vibration, not logically. So the warrior's heart and mind is always filled with humility. And humility is defined by the Tibetan teacher, the Master DK, as an adjusted sense of right proportion. That means we neither inflate or deflate ourselves, but stand in the detached knowing of our deeper identity. It's what I call standing in the sweet spot of power that is our sovereign self. And now we come to the second, disidentification. So the ability to disidentify with all that's claiming our attention and seeking to define us. So we act from a place of non-attachment. So I may be the compassionate warrior, but I am more than the compassionate warrior. My identification is with that fire of love, with that deep spirit. And that deep spirit has taken on the guise and the garb of this compassionate warrior to carry out its work on earth. So disidentification means not being identified as that's who I am, rather than that's the task and that's the role I'm playing to carry out that task. Because our identity is defined by our connection to source and not to any attachment to outer forms or worldly roles. So as the compassionate warrior, I have a task, but I'm not that task. I am the soul in action. You may want to reflect on that yourself, is how do you identify with yourself and how do you identify yourself? What's the story you tell yourself about who you are? Non-investment is the next one. The ability to do whatever is required without becoming captured and enmeshed by the task at hand. Non-attachment to outcome, even though you are totally dedicated and committed to that outcome. So this non-investment allows us the freedom to act in the moment in the most beneficial and unexpected ways possible. If I invest in a form or invest in a particular outcome, it conditions the field and it can actually block inspiration and block the outcome that is intended because I have something else in mind. So we're talking about the art of leading a meditated life, living in the moment, non-attached, and not a premeditated life where we've already come up with what things should look like. So as I say, we're just going to briefly touch on each of these requirements. And the next one is called continual repurification. And I put this in the category of the practice of spiritual hygiene. This is keeping the physical, the emotional, and the mental bodies clean. It's the inner field of consciousness has to be kept clean, clear of distortions, clear of contamination. And we can do this by prayer, meditation, mantra. You can go to the sauna and do it as well. It's anything that helps us release and cleanse and allow the system to be free of any contaminants. So the element of earth in this purification can help keep us grounded. Water can wash us. It can dissolve things. And air can help us breathe new life and blow away stale thinking. But it's the fire, the element of fire, that purifies and cleanses at the deepest level of being. So the compassionate warrior is really a fiery warrior. So the next requirement is non-reaction. We're asked to refrain from reacting to the elements of the surrounding environment and to the people involved so that the warrior is not energetically connected to any of the outer circumstances and pulled off center. I remember reading once a story of a samurai warrior, and his task was to go and find an escaped convict. And this escaped convict was a murderer. And the samurai was asked to find him and execute him, to kill him, because that was the punishment for the misdeed that this person had done. He eventually found the convict. He drew his sword, and at that moment, the convict spat in his face. And the samurai was pulled off center just for a moment. And he caught himself, and he sheathed his sword, and he walked away because he knew that any action carried out from an emotional reaction would not be an expression of pure and impersonal intent. And the samurai, according to the story, returned another day to complete his assignment when he was centered. So this lesson is simple. In carrying out our dharma, it is wise not to create more karma. So I know could be a sort of bloodthirsty story, but it illustrates that when we act off center, we cause more unfortunate things to happen. we create more karma. The next one I'd like to go into more depth, because in the Agni Yoga teachings, this one is emphasized a lot. It's called non-irritation. How many times have you heard yourself say, and others say, oh, I'm really irritated by that? So non-irritation is the capacity to remain centered and not be irritated by anything, regardless of what it is or how it inserts itself between us as the warrior and the goal. And this is one of the most challenging of the requirements. And we're not fully liberated yet from our emotions and from our way of thinking for irritation to totally disappear. So irritation in the Agni Yoga sense creates what they call imperil. Imperil is actually a crystal. It's a chemical precipitate that goes into the body, just like gall and bitterness can condense and precipitate as gallstones in your body. So can irritation create imperil. So I'd like to go through a couple of quotations from the Agni Yoga teachings that specifically talks about irritation, because I know for me, it's probably one of the most difficult. It's so easy to get irritated. So this is what the Agni Yoga teaching has to say. These are 3 different paragraphs or slokas taken from the teaching. It is necessary to distinguish between the indignation of spirit and irritation. The fire of irritation must be divided into 2 kinds. When irritation has an impersonal cosmic character, its poison may be washed away by a current of prana. But if harmful feelings, such as conceit or self-pity, intensify the irritation, the sediment of poison will be precipitated upon the centers, the chakras. Then there is no means to remove it. One can only wear it away by developing cosmic perception. So it's basically saying once you get it inside you, it's a hard one to get out. Then the next quotation. For the last time I shall speak of irritation. Discern its harm, not only personal, but also spatial. This worm, concealed by a smile and politeness, ceaselessly tunnels through the aura. Its harm undermines all works. Agni Yoga has a lot of these very strong statements. And finally, in anger and irritation, man considers himself strong. This is according to earthly considerations. But regarded from the subtle world, the irritated man is especially powerless. He attracts to himself a great number of small entities which feed on the emanations of anger. Besides, he lets down his own bars and allows even the lower beings to read his thoughts. Therefore, the state of irritation is inadmissible, not only as a producer of imperil, but also as a gateway for lower entities. So that's like a strong warning about irritation, and that's why I wanted to name it. The next one was dynamism. And dynamism is really allowing the solar power of the soul to be the constant and compelling source of momentum. It's a dynamo. It's through striving, through seeking to manifest the highest and the best in every moment, it creates this dynamic effect, this dynamo, this dynamism. And what takes away dynamism? Well, it's things like despondency, despair, fear, self-pity. So we need to remain vigilant, and we have to guard against despondency, depression, which really has its roots in self-pity and vain wishing. And this cuts us off from our spiritual source. So dynamism is this power, this dynamo that we can plug into, but we can also cut ourselves off from it. Now, selfless, loving service of the common good. So we're here to be of service to not just the human family, but to life itself on this planet. And sometimes we find that the suffering that we go through produces the greatest strength and the greatest wisdom. So our deepest suffering can be our greatest opportunity to learn about ourselves and to take action to be a better person. So working through suffering, and the Ageless Wisdom teaching says that pain and suffering eventually lead to joy and wisdom. But working through suffering is how we learn to be patient, humble, and grateful. And as we develop strength in the face of personal and painful circumstances, we learn that we don't need to fear the ups and downs of life. This is just how the things happen. This is the natural rhythm. So when we act with this inner calm and peace, we can face anything, and then we can truly act in selfless, loving service of the common good. So that was number 8. We've got one more. So this whole thing of fear getting in the way, the command of the soul is, as I understand it, act out of love, not fear. Many believe the opposite of love to be hate, but maybe the opposite is fear. Fear closes and contracts the heart. Fear closes us down. It cuts us off from the warmth and lovingness of our relationship with others. And fear cuts off the flow of creativity and inspiration. So going back to this selfless loving service and going back to the natural urge of the soul to give of itself, the compassionate warrior is asked to be like the sun, to give freely of the soul's light and love without asking for anything in return. And to do this, a certain degree of liberation has to be achieved. And it takes daring and courage to tread the path of liberation. It takes many lifetimes. And so now we come to the final requirement, which is called daring and joyful striving. Daring is a word you find a lot in the Agni Yoga teachings. It's a fiery word. You dare to do something. Nothing holds you back. It's not being foolhardy. It's when you know you have to do something, you dare to do it. It's a fiery leap. And in the Agni Yoga tradition, they say it is impossible to leap a chasm in 2 bounds. You have to dare to leap it in 1. So daring and joyful striving. This allows us to have the courage to face any challenge and to not be afraid of any physical harm, emotional harm. But we also have to dare to question ourselves, to challenge our own beliefs. So the compassionate warrior has to dare to look at themselves and to dissolve any lies or distortions of the truth that we find to be the root of our own suffering. So to challenge our own beliefs requires courage, because it means that we're putting an end to the illusion about who we are. It's a disidentification. It also takes away this notion that we can find personal safety and security in anything outside of us. So as a warrior, we are not here to defend our beliefs, but we're here to boldly and joyfully challenge them. And in this way, we continuously sift the truth from illusions. But as I say, it requires a lot of discipline and constant awareness to be a compassionate warrior. So as we've just explored, the Bodhisattva warrior that the Dalai Lama spoke about, the compassionate warrior, the fiery warrior, is summoned by the call of the soul in response to the urgent need of the times to serve, even when challenged by seemingly insurmountable odds and distressing circumstances. You can't say, I'd like to, but it's stormy out there, I don't want to get wet. When you signed up and said yes, you show up in all weathers, in all conditions, and you wear a protection against the weathers. That protection is loving kindness. That protection is the consecration of oneself to be of service. So the path of the fiery server is one that is consecrated to selflessly contributing to the good of the whole. And I believe it is a worthy and joyful path because its goal is the liberation of spirit from the prison of matter and the entrapment of emotional patterns and dogmatic thinking. And this is what's needed to break free from that materialistic pull that will allow us to successfully pass that first initiation we talked about earlier. So the good news is that we don't serve alone. We serve together, and together we form a formidable band of sisters and brothers, and we will make a positive difference in the world by showing up as this consecrated and powerful group of agents of divine purpose and love. So there's a lot for us to ponder and act upon in the coming months and years in order to be of greater service. I believe the cry at the moment is all souls on deck, not out of fear, but because it requires a response of the soul to dissolve and dispel the darkness that's currently overshadowing our world and currently obscuring the light of the true sun, the inner soul, from illuminating the planet. So how do we restore health and hope to all aspects of our society? And what's the most effective prophylaxis that can be applied to achieve those ends? So what does the compassionate warrior do? And if I was to sum everything up, the answer would be a simple one. Live from the heart. When you and I live from the heart, the life-giving and nourishing qualities of loving kindness, caring, compassion flow freely from our soul out into the world as a blessing. So living from the heart is also, as we saw earlier, the key to passing the first initiation as a species. So I was reflecting as I was preparing for this broadcast. I remember a couple of years ago, my daughter shared with me that she was really concerned about raising two children with so much negativity and hatred rampant in the world. And she asked me what advice I had. And I thought, oh gosh, what do you say? Parental advice. But my answer was an invitation, not just to her, but for each of us each day to intentionally create a microclimate of goodness in our family, our circle of friends, and in our neighborhood. Because I believe this microclimate of good weather then becomes a positive force that actually influences the larger psychological weather patterns on the planet. So the positively charged weather cells of goodness generated in our homes, in our local communities, will eventually coalesce with other beneficent microclimates that have been created in other parts of the world, and they will create a more clement overall climate for human evolution, and they will significantly help reverse the cancerous growth of unkindness and separation. So these microclimates of goodness are not places to hide out and try to weather the storm. It's the opposite. They're microclimates to change the storm into positive, healthy weather, healthy living. So this change in the global weather, I believe, will move us closer to realizing the dream of Martin Luther King, in which he saw us creating beloved community. And beloved community he saw as a respectful and joyful way of living together in harmony on earth. So let me begin to wrap this up with you. So when I think of going from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga, when I think of the tipping point that's needed to get us through the portal and pass through the first initiation into this new era, the tipping point that moves us from sickness to health as a society is when you and I begin to live soul-inspired lives and move from an egocentric to an ecocentric model of living. That for me is the bottom line of everything. Because this state of communal beingness is where giving and not taking is the norm. and where we know ourselves to be integral aspects of the multi-dimensional ecosystem we call Gaia. So a Gaian society is one where everything serves and supports everything else, because everyone and everything knows that it's part of one evolving organism. Everything is a fractal of the one life. So as we stand here in 2025 in front of the current turbulent times, we're here to create something new. But in order to do that, we have to heal the old. We have to face the patterns of the old. Do we dare to unhook ourselves from the dependency of a non-sustainable model? Because we can see that it's not working. And do we dare to plug into a greater renewable source of goodness that nourishes all? We talk about renewable resources. The soul, the heart, is the font, the reservoir of renewable resource called love, called goodness. This will transform society. This is not a pipe dream. This is something that has to be brought into action by the compassionate warrior, by each of us. And I believe in this radically transformed society, it may be normal to care for one another. It's going to be normal to give and forgive, and normal to see each one of us and each living thing as a vital and valuable aspect of one living system. So my prayer in front of these times is, may all life be held as sacred and thus be respected, honored, and celebrated. But you and I know that all of this is only possible when each of us makes a conscious choice to consecrate and lead lives of joyful service for the common good. I mean, we can't delegate this one. It's up to us. I sincerely pray that we measure up to the task, that together we can be the agents of the soul on earth, that we can be of service in these turbulent times by how we show up together. I know I've given a lot here to ponder and reflect on. I just wanted to speak these things today because we are in times where it's easy to get depressed. We have people coming up to Meditation Mount regularly during the week, carrying a lot of weight, a lot of pain, a lot of unsureness of what the future holds, trying to make sense of things. And all we can do is to remind each other of how to stand in the light and love of the soul, how to join with each other in this sacred communion of activity, and to be of service to our world. So thank you for your presence and participation today. I really appreciate it. And on behalf of the stewardship team here at Meditation Mount, I bid you good evening, and also many blessings on our evolutionary journey together on earth. This is a group endeavor. May love and light and power bring a new world into being. Thank you so much for being with us today. Namaste.